Hi, everyone. So I think we'll get started. My name is Parizad Villamoria, and this is the Harvard Brain Science Initiative's book talk series. And today we're really excited to have with us Dr. Grace Lindsay, who's written the book Models of the Mind, How Physics, Engineering, and Mathematics Have Shaped Our Understanding of the Brain. Dr. Lindsay is a postdoctoral fellow at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit at University College London. She has a PhD in theoretical neuroscience from Columbia University. Before that, she was a research fellow at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Freiburg, Germany. She has a bachelor's degree in neuroscience from the University of Pittsburgh and has won a number of scholarships and fellowships and is really heavily involved in teaching and mentoring in communications and science outreach. She has a website, gracelindsay.com, where she has just a ton of wonderful resources. I was just browsing through, enjoying. She has 5 years of a blog, a podcast on supervised learning, and it's fabulous. And this book is really kind of an accessible introduction to computational neuroscience and its history. It's a topic that I was just telling her I find sometimes as someone trained in more molecular neuro, like pretty intimidating. And she takes that complex topic that's really vast and just breaks it down into fun, like digestible concepts. And what I most like about it is the history of science aspect, the scientists, the personal stories behind what motivates some of the scientists and the discoveries that they've made. And with that, I think I will let her get started.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just see if I can.
Oh, and I should just add, feel free to type questions in the chat box or raise your hand. We'll do questions at the end.
Sorry, just a second. There we go. Okay. So thanks for inviting me. And yeah, I'm excited to share some information about the book and the process that went into writing the book, and happy to hear any questions that people have at the end. Yeah, so the book is, it's organized into chapters that range from focusing on individual neurons up through to populations of neurons and just behavior itself, not even talking about neurons. But, the thread that goes through all of them is that it's a focus on the mathematical techniques that have helped us understand these different parts of the brain or behavior. And so really, the way you can describe it is it's kind of a popular science book about the field of computational neuroscience, but it's meant for people who maybe have never even heard that term, which is kind of part of the motivation, is that I would tell people, strangers at a party or whatever, what I did. And there's nothing you can point to that is like, oh, it's like that. So it was really clear to me that people didn't know that we were using math or any kind of quantitative approaches to study the brain. And you could say maybe that doesn't matter, but I think, people who are in neuroscience have noticed that the quantitative approaches are becoming more and more common, more and more expected, so to speak, and have real value in how we will ultimately understand the brain. And so given the popularity of popular science books about the brain generally that don't talk about mathematical approaches, I thought it's not fair that people don't get to have access to this, because this is an important part of how we understand the brain. And I wanted to show that it's something that could be understood by a general audience. If you just put in the time to make the stories accessible and interesting, you don't need to have a graduate degree in a mathematical field to understand this approach to studying the brain. So that was part of the motivation. But then also another part of the motivation was to provide to the field itself, to people in the field, provide these stories, because there isn't really a single resource that tells you the history of computational neuroscience, or the history of the many different things that we call a computational neuroscience, because it is a very diverse field. And so I wanted to collect the history of science here, and create these narratives that tell the story of all the different ways that the study of the brain has interacted with physics and engineering and mathematics, and kind of the fruitful things that have come of that, because I think it's useful as a scientist to kind of understand the trends of the past and how famous discoveries came about, because it can help you contextualize your own research in the present. So that's kind of the motivation for it. To give you a sense of what the book is like, I'm going to tell a bit of a story from chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called Learning to Compute, and it's really about the history of artificial neural networks and their relationship to the brain and the relationship to artificial intelligence. And so I'm just going to tell, maybe like the first third of that chapter, kind of the main points of that story. So it starts with these two mathematicians, Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead. And Bertrand Russell was a student of Whitehead, and around the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, they were working on this very big project. They wanted to be able to explain all of mathematics by starting with the foundations of logic. So starting with not any empirical facts, not any mathematical statements, but starting with simple, if X, then Y kind of statements. That they wanted to start from that and build up everything about mathematics. And to do that would show the power of these logical statements, that they can then create an entire mathematical system, and it would in theory, help people make sense of mathematics, because there's kind of these disparate parts of mathematics, and it's always a goal of mathematicians to unify them and explain them in kind of simpler and more universal ways. So this was a very big undertaking. It took them several decades, basically, and it was very tumultuous at times. They had, relationship issues with each other. They both separately had relationship issues with their wives at the same time. There's a lot going on. I think there were a few attempts where they kind of got somewhat far using a certain formalism and then had to get rid of it and start over entirely. It went well past its due date for the publisher, but eventually they did create a product. It's known as the Principia Mathematica. It is rather long, as you might expect it would be to do such a big project. And they do start with these formal logical statements. And you can see here, one of their major successes is that they can conclude that 1 + 1 = 2. And I should say this shows up, a couple hundred pages into the book. They're able to finally conclude that 1 + 1 = 2. But, once you got that, you can do a lot more from there. And so they kind of, announced themselves triumphant in a way. And the book obviously did make a big impact on the philosophers of logic and people studying the foundations of mathematics, because it was, it's considered such a monumental thing to be able to unify mathematics with these basic starting seeds. So this book, was out there, and people were reading it. One person who read it was Walter Pitts. He read it, according to certain stories, he read it when he was about 12 years old, when he was hiding from bullies in a library. So there's a claim that he kind of stayed in the library overnight and read the Principia. And he actually said that he found errors in the Principia and wrote a note to Bertrand Russell documenting the errors in the book. And Bertrand Russell actually wrote back offering him a grad student position with him, but Walter Pitts did not take it, perhaps because he was so young. But a few years later, Pitts heard that Bertrand Russell was going to be visiting the University of Chicago. And Pitts lived in Detroit, which is not too far from Chicago. And so he basically ran away from home at age 14 and went to hang out in Chicago to attend Bertrand Russell's lectures and just kind of talk to other people that were at University of Chicago. Bertrand Russell eventually went back to England, and Pitts just stayed in Chicago as a homeless teenager hanging out around the University of Chicago. And he eventually kind of got connected with some other philosophers and people at the intersection of philosophy and mathematics, and some biologists. And he never enrolled as a graduate student, but he essentially functioned as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. Warren McCulloch was a physiologist and a psychiatrist. He studied at Yale and did a medical internship in New York, and he was a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And he also had read the Principia, and he'd read a lot of other philosophy as an undergraduate and otherwise. And he had these kinds of notions about how to think about the brain in what we would now call a computational sense. His inspiration wasn't so directly from computation or mathematics. He was inspired by some of the philosophers that went on to inspire people who created modern concepts of computation. But he had this notion in his head that you could think of the brain as a machine that's implementing computations, and that wasn't really the way people were thinking about it at the time. This was a time where people were using Freudian analysis and other techniques that really treated the mind as completely separate from the brain. There was the neurologists who studied, diseases of neurons and of the spinal cord and all these physical things. And then there were the psychiatrists who studied the mind, and they were just separate populations. There wasn't a sense that there was a need to unite these, or that there was any problem with the fact that they were treated so separately. So Warren McCulloch was a little bit different in his interests about the brain as a practicing physician who had these other notions of how you could think about how the brain works based on it as a physical thing. And at some point, there are multiple different stories of exactly how McCulloch and Pitts met. But they were both in Chicago. They both had some overlapping interests in philosophy and logic. And so they ended up meeting. And actually, Walter Pitts ended up moving in with Warren McCulloch and his wife because he was homeless, and so they offered him that. And they started working together on this notion of how can you formalize what it is that neurons are doing? How can you kind of turn our physical understanding of the brain into a computational understanding, an understanding of how it can implement computations? And the result of this collaboration was this paper published in 1943 called A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Eminent in Nervous Activity. I'm showing the first 3 pages of the paper here, and you can see if you just kind of scan through it, the paper, at least to start, is full of detailed knowledge of neurons, of physiology. It's talking about conduction delays on axons. It's talking about the fact that you have to, the diameter of the axon matters for its speed. It's talking about the soma of the cell and how when an axon meets a soma, that's where you get transmission. It's talking about how there can be excitatory connections that, one cell leads to activity in another, or there can be inhibitory connections where the activity of one cell suppresses activity in another. It's just full of these details about neurophysiology. Kind of a lot of what was known about neurophysiology is put into the first 3 pages of this paper. But then at the end of the first 3 pages here, the start of their theory section, you can see that they kind of take all of this, they show we know all of these details, and all of these details have kind of gone into our understanding of what the brain could be doing. But for their theory, they boil it down to these kind of 5 major assumptions, or not really assumptions because they are experimentally shown, but this is their 5 simplifications about how neurons work. And so that's the activity of a neuron is all or none. We know that a neuron spikes or it doesn't spike. It doesn't have any activity response in between. A certain fixed number of synapses must be excited to lead to that response. They're kind of ignoring a lot of delays in the nervous system. The only significant delay is synaptic delay. And in their assumptions, the activity of an inhibitory synapse completely silences a neuron. So if one inhibitory neuron is on and an input to a cell, then that cell's not going to fire at all. And they're assuming that the structure of a neural circuit doesn't change over time. So they're taking some liberties with their assumptions, but for the most part, they are really grounded in what was known about neurons at the time. But what they do with that knowledge is what's a bit different than what other people were doing with that knowledge. So what they do with that, and this is formalized in work that was done by Pitts, because basically McCulloch had the broad idea, but Pitts came in and had the kind of analytical ability to formalize that. And so I'm showing here these figures, but the rest of the paper is full of very technical equations that Pitts wrote to actually turn this intuition into a formal system of computation. But you can really get the gist of it by looking at some of these simple drawings, and really what their conclusion was, or what they showed could be true as a result of the properties of a neuron, is that neurons can implement formal logic. And the way that you map a neural circuit to logical expression is that you can think of the firing of a neuron, which, as they said, is either spiking or not spiking. It's all or none, it's on or off. You can think of that as being equivalent to a statement that is true or false. So a neuron being on represents a true statement, a neuron being off represents a false statement. And then the way that you connect the neurons lets you implement these logical expressions. So for example, if you look at the diagram labeled C here, if you want to implement the logical expression, this would be 1 and 2, or X and Y, depending on how you want to name your variables, but I'll use numbers because that's how they're labeled here in the neurons. If you want to implement that, you have a circuit such that a third neuron gets inputs from neurons 1 and 2, and its threshold is such that it needs to have both of its inputs on to fire. And so that means that neuron 1 and neuron 2 both need to be active. So both X and Y need to be true for neuron 3 to be active, for the conclusion to be true. So that's implementing the statement X and Y. If both X and Y are true, the outcome of that expression is true. If both neuron 1 and 2 are on, the outcome neuron 3 is on. And you can do the same thing to implement OR. So when you want to implement OR, the nature of the OR operation is such that you only need one of your inputs to be on for the outcome of an OR expression to be true. So here we get input from 2 neurons, but both of these neurons give themselves an input of strength 2 to the neuron, so only one of them needs to be on for that neuron to be active. So now if 1 or 2 is on, 3 is on. Also, if they're both on, 3 is on. But this lets the output neuron be active if only one of its inputs is on, rather than needing both of them to be on. And then to implement not, which is another important part of logical expressions, to negate a statement, you can have an inhibitory connection. So for the circuit D here, this is saying if 1 is true and 2 is not true, then you'll get the output that you want from that neuron. So really, and then the other examples here are just building up on that, starting with these simple building blocks and creating and implementing even more complex logical statements, which was shown through Bertrand and to Russell and Whitehead, that having the basics of logic, you can build up anything. You can do all of mathematics. So if you can get the basics of logic into neural circuits, and then you can just build more and more complex neural circuits, that can explain how the brain can do what it does. So to kind of go more into this understanding of what McCulloch and Pitts showed, I want to just do a short reading from chapter 3 on this section. The ability to spot logic and play in the interactions of neurons came from McCulloch's discerning eye. As a physiologist, he knew that neurons were more complex than his simple drawings and equations suggested. They had membranes, ion channels, and forking paths of dendrites. But the theory didn't need their full complexity. So like an impressionist painter using only the necessary strokes, he intentionally highlighted only the elements of neural activity required for the story he wanted to tell. In doing so, he demonstrated the artistry inherent to model building. It is a subjective and creative process to decide which facts belong in the foreground. The radical story that McCulloch and Pitts told with their model, that neurons were performing a logical calculus, was the first attempt to use the principles of computation to turn the mind-body problem into a mind-body connection. Networks of neurons were now imbued with all the power of a formal logical system. Like a chain of falling dominoes, once certain truth values entered into a neural population, say via sensory organs, a cascade of interactions could deduce the truth value of new and different statements. This meant a population of neurons could carry out endless computations, interpreting sensory inputs, developing conclusions, forming plans, reasoning through arguments, performing calculations, and so on. With this step in their research, McCulloch and Pitts advanced the study of human thought and, at the same time, kicked it off its throne. The mind lost its status as mysterious and ethereal once it was brought down to solid ground. That is, once its grand abilities were reduced to the firing of neurons. To adapt a quote from Jerry Levin, The brain could now be thought of as, quote, a machine, meaty and miraculous, but still a machine. More boldly still, McCulloch's student Michael Arbib later remarked that their work, quote, killed dualism. So this is the student Michael Arbib, and you can imagine that killing dualism, which is a big trend in the history of philosophy, would be quite a big deal. Now, the interesting flip side of the grandiosity of what they did is that its impact on actual neuroscientists at the time was very limited. So a review on nerve conduction that was written a few years after McCulloch and Pitt's paper, it cites the paper, but cites it as saying it is, quote, not for the lay reader, and that it would be necessary for physiologists to familiarize themselves with mathematical technology, or for mathematicians to elaborate at least their conclusions in a less formidable language if this kind of work is going to be useful to them. So really, there was all of this, importance in the work in a philosophical sense, but in a applied sense, the neuroscientists at the time just didn't know what to do with it. They didn't necessarily know how to understand it. It didn't lead to any obvious experiments to be done. And so for the most part, the neuroscientists at the time ignored what McCulloch and Pitts had shown, despite it being seemingly so important. But there was a group of people who did take an interest in McCulloch and Pitts' work. And this group met kind of primarily through the Macy Foundation, which was a philanthropic organization that sponsored these meetings that were meant to bring together people interested in logic and math and biology and kind of take inspiration from the mind to create intelligent machines. That was some of the focus of these meetings. And so one person who attended those meetings, McCulloch was there, he was in charge of some of them, but one of the attendees was John von Neumann, who is known now for the von Neumann architecture, the architecture of the modern computer. And von Neumann acknowledges that he was directly influenced in the architecture of the modern computer by the work of McCulloch and Pitts and this idea of their binary neurons interacting. So that direction certainly was an impactful outcome of McCulloch and Pitts' work. And on top of that, kind of the general starting of what was known as cybernetics, now more commonly called artificial intelligence, that kind of work did get a basis in the type of stuff that McCulloch and Pitts were doing, but it wasn't the neuroscientists who were taking much note of that. Now, today we know that artificial intelligence is doing pretty well. It's having kind of a boom period. You can hear about it in the news a lot. And the basis for that is artificial neural networks in most cases. And not only are artificial neural networks doing well in applications in the real world in artificial intelligence, but artificial neural networks are also being used in neuroscience. They're commonly used as an example here of a relationship between a deep artificial neural network and the primate visual system. They are commonly being used as models of processing for understanding how the brain works. They're being used to make models of biological neural processing. We're using these artificial neural networks to do that. And so what changed really? I mean, I said that it wasn't McCulloch and Pitts' work that was directly inspiring neuroscientists to think about artificial neural networks as something useful for their own work. But now we do have that connection. We do think of artificial neural networks as something useful. And the truth is that it wasn't directly the type of artificial neural network that McCulloch and Pitts worked with. That's not the form that is so impactful today. The types of artificial neural networks that are used today are based on what was called a perceptron. And this was developed in the late 50s by Frank Rosenblatt. And you can see here, this is Frank Rosenblatt with the perceptron. It was a physical machine that he built, a computer that he built that was an implementation of an artificial neural network. And so that means it had these kind of individual units that got input from other units, and then they would create their own output. And it was via the connections between these simple units that you got some sort of interesting computation to occur. And so in that sense, it was inspired by McCulloch and Pitts. But the major difference is that it didn't work according to the rules of formal logic. The perceptron doesn't aim to implement logical statements that can be easily mapped to these X and Y, X or Y kind of statements. It just didn't use that framework at all. And in fact, the output units in the perceptron don't even need to be on or off. They don't need to be binary. They can take any number as an output that can be used as an output. So you can have continuous valued outputs instead of binary. And so that really reduces the mapping to the true false values. And on top of that, the connections between the neurons, in McCulloch and Pitts, they had to set those connections, and they even say in their paper, those connections don't change. You set them according to the logical function that you want the circuit to implement, and then they're fixed that way because that's the only way they can continue to implement that logical function. With the perceptron, the whole point of it was that it learns its own connections. So Rosenblatt didn't have to come in and say this neuron connects to that neuron. He had an algorithm for the network to teach itself how it should connect itself. And so that really throws away the whole idea that you're implementing these precise logical statements, because you don't even know what the network is really implementing because it learned its own connections. And that is very important to the success of these networks today in the field of machine learning. The reason that they're so useful is that you don't, as the person building them, you don't have to know the answer of how to solve the confusing task that you want your computer to do. You can just give it some examples of how to do that task, and the network can learn itself to set its connections the right way. So it's a very different approach, despite the fact that it's still an artificial neural network, and in some of the base facts of it, it's the same as what McCulloch and Pitts put forward. It does away with the beauty of being based on logic. It's messy. I mean, it's kind of like what you see here. It's messy. And that really, that wasn't the spirit of what McCulloch and Pitts were so excited about in their work, about the beauty of kind of being able to implement logic and do something that was formally proven to be powerful. The perceptron is more just, well, it works, so we want to keep using it. Going back to Bertrand Russell and the Principia, there's a bit of an analog here, because in the 1930s, so about 20 years after the Principia was published, a discovery was made that's now known as the incompleteness theorem. And what that showed was that Russell and Whitehead had not, as they claimed, proven that all of mathematics could be created from logic. There were errors in their work that meant that they actually hadn't done that. And on top of that, the incompleteness theorem said that actually it couldn't be done at all. So it wasn't just that they didn't do it, it was impossible. And the incompleteness theorem has had broad implications, very impactful. And so, you can look at it as the Principia Mathematica was a failure, but the Principia Mathematica was a direct inspiration for the discovery of the incompleteness theorem, which has gone on to be very impactful. And so McCulloch and Pitts, you could say, oh, their work was a failure because it dead-ended in terms of not impacting neuroscience, but it did have an impact in the form of artificial neural networks we use now that, doesn't rely on formal logic, but still takes the same basic shape. And those have been very impactful. So there is quite an analog between these two things. So Bertrand Russell, obviously wouldn't have been thrilled to know that something that he poured so much of his life into ended up kind of being a failure in that way. But he was mostly able to handle it. Walter Pitts, on the other hand, was much more kind of wedded to this notion of understanding the brain in this formal way. Because he was so analytically minded, the idea that the brain doesn't obey these strict rules was very difficult for him to accept. And a combination of kind of this trend in research that was going away from understanding the brain as a formal logical system, combined with some issues he had with a mentor of his that led the mentor to stop talking to him entirely. There were a lot of things that came up later in his life where he really started to spiral, and he had a drinking problem, and he eventually kind of completely removed himself from his work and from his connections with his friends. And he died in 1969, which was actually the same year that Warren McCulloch died. But of course, McCulloch was 25 years older. So it was a bit of a sad end for Walter Pitts after kind of the very impressive work he did, both in founding the field of artificial neural networks and also many other areas in neuroscience he was involved in. So I think, that gives you a little bit of a sense of how how the book is structured and what I wanted to convey. As I said, each of these different chapters focuses on different topic areas in neuroscience, but in all of them there is this attempt to find this narrative that gives you a nice exploration of how ideas have evolved over time through interaction with mathematics and mathematical modeling. So yeah, that was my hope with each of these chapters. They almost function as kind of standalone essays on the history and the trajectory of an idea in mathematical neuroscience. And I wanted to go into now a little bit kind of how that worked behind the scenes, how I studied the history to create these narratives. And so one major technique that I used was just kind of following citations. So just, through my own experience being in computational neuroscience, there were certain landmark papers that I was aware of. And so I would kind of start with one of those. So for example, this is pulled from the chapter that's on vision. And there's a paper called the neocognitron that I knew was important in the history of modeling visual systems. And so you can, start with some landmark paper and follow it forward by looking at what papers cite it and see, what other important papers have cited this important paper, and then you kind of build out. And that's how, you can see here a connection from the neocognitron to modern successes in computer vision. But then you can also work backwards and see what papers did this paper cite and what did those cite. And that takes you back into kind of deep into the history of studying the visual system on the neuroscience side. And actually you can see here this, what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain paper, which was very influential in the study of vision. Walter Pitts is actually an author on that paper as well. So he was really all over the place. But yeah, so in general, these kind of citation trails of, starting with some landmark paper and just trying to understand the whole context around it was one way of being able to follow an idea through history. And then another nice way, because it almost does the storytelling itself, is reading biographies or autobiographies from scientists. So especially to get, some of the personal details, some of the drama, some of the surprises, that kind of stuff, that really required looking at the stories from the scientists themselves. And there were a few resources that were good for that. Certain scientists either are famous enough, they have a biography or multiple biographies written about them. Other scientists wrote their own autobiographies. And then also, particularly for my purposes, the Society for Neuroscience has actually collected short autobiographies from many different prominent neuroscience professors. So that was really helpful. And those are like only 30 pages, but they kind of give you someone's general overview of how they see their career. And depending on the person, sometimes a lot of detail of the personal side, other times more of a summary of their research work. But either way, it's useful to see how a scientist, sees their own progress. So that was definitely another big source of how to piece together the narratives. And doing so, there were some, some themes that emerged in doing this historical research that were fun to see. One is that certain things that we now think are obvious in neuroscience were actually not obvious, and also sometimes even actively disbelieved. So neuroscientists at one point thought that the cortex was not excitable and was not, part of controlling the body or anything like that. They thought it was like a shell that kept everything else warm or whatever. So this is from the chapter on motor control, because it was actually people studying motor cortex who first kind of really proved actually, yes, cortex does something. We can get it to cause movements, we can excite it. But the work of the people who were doing that in the motor cortex was kind of ignored by the rest of the neuroscience community for a while, because they were so certain that that this wasn't the case. And it's really because, so they were talking about the cerebral hemispheres had been found to give no reaction to any form of stimulation applied to them, mechanical, chemical, thermal, or even electrical. And it seems to be the case that they were just doing kind of inappropriate types of stimulation to get the cortex to do anything. But once the people interested in motor cortex came along and used the right kind of electrical stimulation, obviously they were able to get movement to be produced and to correct that misconception. especially from reading the personal stories, you can find that neuroscience, or that all science in general, is not entirely pure in its motivations or the way that it comes to conclusions. So in chapter 3, in the chapter on artificial neural networks, I talk about after the perceptron became very popular, there was a bit of a backlash to it, and there was a book written about all of its limitations. And the book is factual, it's accurate, it does mathematical analysis of the perceptron and finds limitations, but there was an admission by one of the authors that there was some hostility in the research and some annoyance that the fact that the perceptron was getting so much positive attention. It was there was this hype and mania around the perceptron, and the authors of this book were a little annoyed that people were so excited about this thing, and that did drive them to do this research to some extent. Also, you can find that a lot of things, especially attitudes that scientists have, simply don't change over time. So these are 2 quotes. The literature in neuroscience and psychology is now so large and growing so fast that no one can master what has been written or keep up with current work. And also, here's the deficit in neuroscience. We can observe the results of processing in the behavior of animals and records taken from individual neurons, but we cannot account for either by mechanism. And those were both from the same essay written 30 years ago. And I feel like you could see the same exact things said today. Everyone feels like, oh, right now is really when people are publishing too many papers. And if only I could have been a scientist before, when things were simple. So yeah, and also, the notion that we still have trouble connecting neural activity to behavior and all of that remains an open problem in neuroscience. So I don't know, maybe that's a sign that we're doing something wrong, or it's just a sign that people are always the same. And it's also nice to see that everyone struggled, even very well-known scientists. So this is a quote from Charles Darwin: "I am very poorly today and very stupid and hate everybody and everything." So if Darwin could feel that way, you can feel a little bit better about yourself. Also, for the purposes of my book, I have this quote in there: "I have deeply regretted that I did not proceed far enough, at least to understand something of the great leading principles of mathematics, for men thus endowed seem to have an extra sense." So that's Charles Darwin feeling bad that he didn't know enough math. And then also looking at these personal stories also shows you that so much of what went on to be a major discovery, in this case a Nobel Prize winning discovery, was simply the role, can be reduced to luck or serendipity. This is the case of Hubel and Wiesel studying the visual system and accidentally discovering that the neurons they were recording from respond to oriented bars of light. They were not trying to show them oriented bars of light, but they accidentally did, and they got a response. And there's also a lot of other examples of just, people happening to attend a talk that was given by, someone outside of their field, and that led to this amazing synergistic relationship and all that kind of thing. And these are things that you can't really control on any fine level. You just have to kind of hope that they happen to you if you want to make a big discovery. So I wanted to end just by reading a short section of the first chapter, just because the first chapter is not about a particular topic. It's kind of laying out the whole motivation for the book and what the themes are in it. And I just want to reiterate this kind of theme from the book. And so the first chapter is called Spherical Cows, and that is based on this old joke about physicists that says that there was a farmer who was having trouble getting his cows to produce milk. And so he went to the local university and talked to a physicist there and asked him if he could help him with his problems with his cows. And the physicist thought about it and then came back to the farmer and said, "Okay, I have a solution. First, we must assume a spherical cow in a vacuum." And the idea behind that joke is just that physicists tend to simplify things to a point that may seem absurd to an outside person who's not steeped in the field. And kind of a point I'm trying to make in the first chapter is that tension is real. Biologists are, closer to the farmer dealing with the cow. They have to deal with these real world details and real organisms. And so when they come in contact with the type of mathematical modeling normally done in physics, there can be a clash, and we have to consider that. And I think that is a theme throughout the book, is that kind of tension. So I'm just going to read a short passage about that tension in mathematical modeling. The brain, composed of, in the case of humans, some 100 billion neurons, each their own bubbling factory of chemicals and electricity, all interacting in a jumble of ways with their neighbors both near and far, is a prime example of a biological object too complex to be understood without mathematics. The brain is the seat of cognition and consciousness. It is responsible for how we feel, how we think, how we move, who we are. It is where days are planned, memories are stored, passions are felt, choices are made, words are read. It is the inspiration for artificial intelligence and the source of mental illness. To understand how all this can be accomplished by a single complex of cells interfacing with the body and the world demands mathematical modeling at multiple levels. Despite the hesitancy felt by some biologists, mathematical models can be found hidden in all corners of the history of neuroscience. While it was traditionally the domain of adventurous physicists or wandering mathematicians, today theoretical or computational neuroscience is a fully developed subdivision of the neuroscience enterprise with dedicated journals, conferences, textbooks, and funding sources. The mathematical mindset is influencing the whole of the study of the brain. As Professor Larry Abbott wrote, quote, biology used to be a refuge for students fleeing mathematics, but now many life science students have a solid knowledge of basic mathematics and computer programming, and those that don't at least feel a little guilty about it. Yet the biologist's apprehension around mathematical models should not be entirely dismissed. All models are wrong, starts the popular phrase by statistician George Box. Indeed, all models are wrong, because all models ignore some details. All models are also wrong because they represent only a biased view of the processes they claim to capture. And all models are wrong because they favor simplicity over absolute accuracy. All models are wrong the same way all poems are wrong. They capture an essence, if not a perfect literal truth. All models are wrong, but some are useful, says Box. If the farmer in the old joke reminded the physicist that cows are not in fact spherical, the physicist's response would be, who cares? Or more accurately, do we need to care? Detail for detail's sake is not a virtue. A map the size of the city has no good use. The art of mathematical modeling is in deciding which details matter and steadfastly ignoring those that do not. So I really do think that shows up a lot in the chapters, that the notion of having to choose the details that matter and ignoring the ones that don't. And I think that is the blessing and the curse of making these mathematical models of the brain. So yeah, that's all that I had planned to talk about. So I'm happy to hear if there are any questions about the book or book writing process in general or anything like that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Do people have questions? I could get us going with one question I had just as you were talking about your process for writing the book and the different autobiographies you read. Do you have a couple of favorite characters from all your research?
I did. So I think I mentioned in one of the readings, there was a guy named Jerry Letvin who was kind of hanging around a lot of like McCulloch and Pitts and other people of the time. And he doesn't have like a prominent role in the book because he wasn't like the main character in any of the stories. But he just, he seemed like a funny guy to me. He like described himself as an overweight slob, and he was like very down on himself and talked about how he wanted to like go into philosophy or other fields, but his mom made him be a doctor. And he seemed like he would be fun to hang out with. So that was definitely one. And also Claude Shannon is an interesting guy. He's behind information theory, which is what one of the chapters is about. And he just was kind of almost like a Willy Wonka character, the way he's described. He made all these gadgets and he was always doing these fun things. And, despite the fact that he was working on communications theory during World War II in this like setting that seems very serious, like the government was taking scientists to do these things. He just seemed like he was a pretty goofy guy.
Thank you. That's really fun. I see Jeff has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to wait to see if there were other hands up, but I'll jump in. But Grace, I really enjoyed all of that. I'm Jeff Mackless. Nice to meet you in this virtual way. But before I ask my question, I'll tell you, so I knew Jerry Letvin. I studied with Jerry Letvin. He was a big fat slob, a brilliant big fat slob who did things like debate Timothy Leary before my time on the steps of the Student Center at MIT, basically confronting sort of a utopianism of LSD with neurophysiology. And if you like Jerry that much, you may or may not know, so Jerry was this big, huge, chain-smoking guy who never had a shirt tucked in, and his wife, Maggie, wrote Maggie's Back Book and was an early health food fanatic and Cantabrigian sort of yoga guru, amazing dancer, so it was quite a duo to have dinner with, I'll say that. But my question is, and having not read the book, do you have a chapter or do you have thoughts on how the modeling world is dealing with the rapid advances in let's say, cellular, molecular, circuit building neuroscience that sets, in my mind, some of the framing rules and some of the solution space, and how those come together? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I think the related components in the book would be, I mean, the first real chapter is about Hodgkin-Huxley and, considering the neuron in its full, biological form rather than these simplified artificial models, and how you can use that to, you can use the building blocks of like electrical circuits and stuff to create elaborate neural models. And then at other points, that kind of fact comes into play. So for example, when I talk about the modern approach to thinking about learning, it does bring into account the fact that you have to consider that there are different parts of the dendrite that might be getting different inputs and have these nonlinearities that can be used to implement more complicated learning rules. So there are definitely, parts sprinkled throughout where thinking about the neuron really as a cell and all the different cellular parts and all of that really come into play. And then methods for actually kind of reconstructing full neural circuits of like who's connected to who kind of thing. There is a chapter on basically network neuroscience and connectomes and the use of kind of graph theory methods for understanding neural connectivity. So that comes in there. But I think in general, all of those details have to be put into a context of what exactly you want to use them to explain. So yeah, like for learning algorithms, there are certain, details about the shape of the cell or the signaling molecules and all that can have a computational role that will be relevant to explaining learning. And yeah, different use cases will have different details that matter more or less. And that's kind of, this issue of knowing which details to include and which you don't have to include.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
While we wait for more questions, one thing I wanted to ask a little bit about was mental health aspects. Like in one of the chapters, you allude to disconnection syndromes and graph theory. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I found it interesting.
Yeah, so yeah, this is in the network neuroscience chapter where people are basically trying to think about, this is an old idea, this disconnection syndrome idea, thinking about certain maladaptive behaviors as being the result of kind of miswired brains, basically. And so it's, kind of a very basic form of this is that if the prefrontal cortex doesn't have enough control over the rest of the brain, you might get hallucinations or you might get people with impulsive behavior or that kind of thing, depending on exactly what the issues are. So it's just this idea that you can kind of think about, and this is normally done at kind of the broad anatomical scale, like brain region to brain region kind of connectivity, but that you could conceptualize certain disorders as maybe having that as their anatomical basis. And kind of where the mathematical modeling comes in is that, if you have this like set of connections, like this brain region is connected to this brain region with this strength, and you have this full matrix of what the connectivity is, you can't just really look at that and be like, oh, I see that's different between these two people or whatever. You need some metrics that simplify that you can like boil down an entire connectivity matrix into a few numbers that give you its basic properties. And so that's where things like graph theory come in, because they've been applied in other fields that also deal with network structures. So like the internet or social graphs, that kind of thing. People have come up with these types of metrics that can give you can give you a sense of, is the network heavily clustered in the sense of there's a bunch of regions that interact strongly with each other and only have light connections between each other. Those are the kind of metrics. And so what people have been doing lately, it's relatively new compared to some of the other stuff I talk about in the book, but what people have been doing is kind of comparing across patient and control groups on these metrics and saying, do certain disorders have a signature in the way the connectome is structured, this high level connectome. And basically, yeah, they're finding some signatures of that. I would say, I think because it is early, you might expect a lot of findings, and then they'll be whittled down to like the ones that really are robust, or they can be interpreted as having useful meaning in this context. But it's definitely opened up this new avenue for looking at the full brain rather than just kind of thinking about the activity in individual regions.
So this connectome you're talking about more recently, do you mean like a functional connectome, like looking at fMRI imaging data?
Yeah, so in the book, I don't bring up functional connectivity because it seemed, it seemed to complicate the matter a little bit because the title of that chapter is From Structure to Function. So I'm trying to talk about how structural connectivity can lead to function. And so there are ways to get an estimate of the structural connectivity through MRI metrics and things like that, looking at white matter and everything. So that's what I focus on in the book. But yeah, people do apply these same metrics to the functional connectome, which is, this matrix of how correlated activity is across brain areas, not based on the actual physical connections.
Thank you. It's really fascinating to me. Like psychiatry is something I always thought of as such a non-mathematical thing, learning about it initially, and it's really cool to hear about computational psychiatry.
Yeah, and I would say there's also a bit of that in the chapter on reinforcement learning, because that gives a kind of computational algorithmic model for understanding how people process rewards, which obviously can have a lot of interactions with behavior and explaining maladaptive behavior in that sense as well.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Hear about Pavlov and his personality. That was fascinating. Also, like the part on Richard Bellman, and some of the work he did in his personality, also very fascinating.
Yeah, he titled his own autobiography "The Eye of the Hurricane," so I think it tells you something about him.
Yeah, I would not have known that, but that makes me even more interested to read it, I guess. Do other people have any questions or comments? If not, then I think we will close this out. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wonderful work. For anyone who is interested, you can go to gracelindsay.com, right? That's the best place to find out where to get the book.
Yeah, that's good. Or just Google Models of the Mind, Grace Lindsay, anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so thank you so much for taking the time to share your work with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so thanks.
Bye.